Chapter 14. Jack spends a large portion of the chapter unconscious. Jamie had had a long day. It started with Jack and Baby Tooth saying goodbye early in the morning. Jamie understood why he couldn't come with them, both for his own safety and because Hiccup would definitely refuse to let Jamie tag along. But that didn't mean he didn't feel bitter and nervous about being left behind. Jack knew that. He'd been visibly upset, even though he tried to act optimistic. Not only did he feel bad because Jamie was unhappy, he was also worried about leaving him alone in the first place, especially since Baby Tooth was joining Jack on this little quest instead of watching over Jamie. But he promised they wouldn't be long and that Jamie would be just fine on his own, as long as he didn't take any more night walks in the woods. And Jamie put on a brave face too, because Jack had a mission ahead of him that needed all his focus. Jamie had been the center of his attention long enough. So he'd hugged Jack goodbye and let Baby Tooth gently press her cheek against his forehead before they both hurried out of the hut to catch up with Hiccup and the others before they left. And then Jamie was alone. Gobber had asked him where Jack was when he got to the forge, and Jamie had replied stiffly that he didn't know. He got the feeling Gobber knew he was lying, but he didn't press the subject. Instead, he'd offered Jamie a piece of his breakfast, bread as hard as rocks and some dry meat, which Jamie had learned to accept gratefully because there was no such thing as a gourmet on Berk. He got to work, and the day slowly went by. Gobber took care of the customers, and Jamie even got to watch him fix some deadly nethertooth. He also studied some of Hiccup's old designs, but it was hard to understand since he couldn't read runes. Babytooth magic didn't cover written language, apparently. As the day went on, Gobber got too busy to pay Jamie any attention, and Jamie got too tired to do any proper work. Instead, he found a nearly empty table, some coal and a piece of parchment, and started doodling. While the day sagged on painfully slow, dinner somehow still approached at an alarming speed. Without Jack or Astrid or any of the others, Jamie didn't know if he had the guts to go in there. Any other time, he'd just stick with Jack and his friends, and if the other kids came by, he could just pretend to be in deep conversation with Jack. Jack, of course, saw right through Jamie and knew exactly what he was doing, but he always entertained him anyway. If the same happened with Jamie's mom, she would have forced him to go play with the other kids, so he was really grateful that Jack didn't. But now? Stupid, he mumbled to himself, absently sketching the outline of the Easter Bunny. We defeat the Nightmare King, but this is too scary. Though I guess Vikings were supposedly pretty terrifying. But not these Vikings. Or... He scratched his cheek. The wounds from his fall were almost completely faded now. He shook his head. No. Dinner versus pitch? No contest. Right, baby. He looked up, only to remember that his nearly ever-present company was no longer present. His heart sank. Right, he mumbled, looking back down at the drawing. I'm talking to myself. You do that a lot? Jamie broke the coal piece in half. He whipped around to find Bran standing behind him, and when their eyes met, Bran took a surprised step back. Sorry, he quickly said. Didn't mean to scare you. Jamie's heart was pounding. He hadn't noticed he'd spoken in Norse, but he forced his expression into a neutral one. You didn't. I mean, it's all right, he said. He rolled one half of the coal piece idly back and forth on the table. What's up? I thought I saw Jack flying on the back of Ruffnet and Tuffnut's dragon this morning, he said. I'm not sure, but who else could it have been? I didn't look very safe, so I figured you weren't with him. Jamie wasn't sure if he should act surprised or not. He decided he wasn't a good liar anyway, and dropped the act. Oh, yeah, Jack wanted to go with Hiccup and the others, I guess. A smile tugged on his lips. Hiccup refused, so he had to sneak along? Brent snorted, his brows knitted together. Why? Dunno. Dragons? Okay. Brent squinted at him. That's definitely suspicious. You're not a very good liar. Jamie wanted to say that he already knew that, but he kept his mouth shut. But whatever, Brand continued. I don't really understand you guys, but you seem okay. I won't, try to make you talk again. He fidgeted with the hem of his tunic, a slight frown on his face. Thanks, Jamie said, after a moment. So will you stop avoiding us already? Oh no, Jamie averted his eyes. I'm not avoiding you, he tried. Uh-huh, Brand said. He studied Jamie for a few seconds before he sighed. Anders and Hildo can be pretty intense. Jamie didn't confirm or deny. At least, not out loud. Also, I guess we've all been kinda, Brand continued slowly, like it pained him. Difficult. Are you trying to apologize? Jamie asked. Brand shrugged. Have been for a while, but you were always conveniently busy with Jack. I had to take this chance while I had it. Jamie chewed the inside of his cheek. He's not going to be gone for long, he said. Is that like a threat or something? Brand asked with a slightly amused smile. He doesn't need to protect you from us. There was laughter in his voice, but when Jamie's cheeks got warm, he seemed to regret it. He faltered. I mean, look, Hildo is scary. She thinks she's the super mysterious, all-knowing trickster or whatever, but she's not out to get you. She? Jamie said. Brand blinked. Yeah? He said. Hildo is a girl, didn't you know? Jamie didn't answer. He started sketching again, just as something to do with his hands. It didn't help. The air just felt more awkward. Brand came closer to the table after a few seconds. What's that? A rabbit? Jamie wanted to slap himself. Was this supposed to be classified or something? Maybe not. Hiccup had mentioned something about Jack's friend Sandy at one point, so obviously Jack had talked about the other Guardians to him. What he'd said exactly, Jamie didn't know. Probably not that one of his friends was a 6-foot-tall talking rabbit with an affinity for colorful eggs. Yeah. Why is it so big? I don't know. I was surprised too. Brand smiled uncertainly. Surprise? Jamie looked up for help, but then realized again that Babytooth wasn't there. He glanced briefly at Brand and then stared down at the drawing as the gears in his head turned to come up with some sensible story. Preferably one that wasn't entirely a lie, since he apparently was so inept at that. I mean, he's the biggest bunny I ever saw, he mumbled vaguely. You've seen it in real life? Brand asked. That's a real rabbit? Jamie had to smile at that. Yeah, he's real. Do you have many rabbits like that where you come from? He's the only one, as far as I know. Wow, you don't have dragons, but you have giant rabbits? Brand muttered, before pointing to another doodle. What's that? My dog, Abby, Jamie replied with a small laugh. Brand frowned. Weird dog, he commented. And who's that? Santa, North, Jack's friend. That's a reindeer, and that's... He hesitated. It was a doodle of Jack, but it showed him hovering in the air, shooting eyes out of his staff. Jokel Frosty. That's Jokel Frosty? Brand asked. Isn't that Jack? Jamie smiled nervously. What? That's Jack's staff, isn't it? Oh, it's similar, I guess. Brand seemed to be weighing his words. Jamie, he started. Jack wasn't the one who told you about Jokel Frosty, was he? Jamie put down the coal piece and turned fully to Brand. If you're going to suggest Jack came up with the story, you can spare yourself the trouble, he told him. That's not true. But it even looks like Jack, Brand argued. Yeah, well, Jamie gestured vaguely. It doesn't matter. I know what I've seen, and I've seen Jokel Frosty. Maybe Jack dressed up. Dressing up won't give you magic powers, Brand. Jamie crossed his arms. Jack isn't Jokel. I mean... He shook his head, and Brand raised a brow. Jamie wasn't sure how much he should tell him, but he also didn't want to lie. Jack was Jokel Frosty, but not in the way Brand expected. Listen, he said, looking intently into Brand's eyes. You haven't seen what I've seen, and I don't have any way to prove it, but magic is real, Brand. That's why Jack went with the others. He's trying to find the Snow Queen. Maybe that was too much. Brand looked at him like he just revealed he was from the future. We never should have told you about that, he said. Jamie held back a groan. Brand, I'm telling you, he insisted, his voice rising in pitch. I don't know if the Snow Queen is real, but if you'd seen what I'd seen, you'd know it's not as impossible as it sounds. What you've seen? Brand repeated warily. You know, a whole bunch of people still think you're crazy. So you might have seen a lot of things that... Jamie ran a hand over his face. I'm not hallucinating, he said. I'm not crazy. Neither is Jack. Even if the Snow Queen was real, why would Jack want to find her? Brand asked. Because she might... Jamie started, but cut himself off. He hesitated. There's some weird stuff going on, right? I mean, how did we get here? Maybe it really was a curse or something. Maybe she knows something about it. We did appear in a blizzard, after all. Brand looked at him for a long time. He was doubtful, but the fact that he was even letting Jamie speak about this was at least a small step forward. Also, there was a kind of curiousness in his eyes that hadn't been there before, like he was letting himself consider that maybe Jamie wasn't as crazy as people would have him believe. At least, that's what Jamie hoped. What about Peach? Jamie's heart skipped a beat. What? He said, his voice breaking a little. You said something about Peach, he said. Dinner versus Peach, no contest. What's a Peach? It took a few seconds before Jamie found his voice again, and he laughed in relief. Oh, right, he muttered. Brand had overheard him, of course. Pitch wasn't a known legend on Berk. Hopefully, he didn't even exist yet. No one, really. Just a bad dream. Brand was giving him a long look again, and Jamie was afraid he was going to press the subject. Not that Pitch deserved any pity, but Jamie didn't want to be forced to lie and say that he wasn't real. Pitch, whatever had happened to him after Easter, was very real, and as a principle, Jamie didn't want to deny that. Instead, Brand came up with an almost equally scary question. Do you want to sit with me during dinner today? Jamie guessed his poker face wasn't doing him any favors, because Brand smiled apologetically. Like I said, Hillary isn't as scary as she seems. Neither is Unis, he said. They're just brash and really curious. But really, you're cool, Jamie. I can try to rein them in for you. Jamie didn't know what to say to that. And I just hope you're not angry because because of the boar incident. Brand scratched his cheek. Angry? Jamie repeated with a frown. Was he angry? He thought about it for a few seconds before shaking his head. A little exasperated, maybe, but... Brand looked amused again. You're not angry about that? But you're angry when I tried to tell you that the Snow Queen isn't real. Jamie scoffed. What happened in the woods sucked, but it was an accident, he said. But you won't believe me when I'm telling the truth, and that's annoying. I've seen things, I mean it. Like, he made it snow in my room. Maybe you were asleep, Brand suggested. No, Jamie protested. Brand, I am not lying. I'm not seeing things and I'm not crazy. You have to believe me. Brand pressed his lips together. He glanced out of the workshop where people were heading for dinner. Say, you are telling the truth, he said slowly. What exactly have you seen? Jamie felt a smile spread on his lips. He grabbed Brand's arm and tugged him along. I'll sit with you at dinner, he said, and I'll tell you all about it. If Hiccup thought Jack was quick to fall asleep, he was sorely mistaken. Hiccup's heart was beating fiercely in comparison to his otherwise calm attitude. Judging by how easily he decided to put his arm around Jack, Jack almost thought it was second nature to him. But Jack's arms were pinned between his own chest and Hiccup's, and he could feel Hiccup's heart pound against them. Hiccup was more nervous about this than he let on, which, in turn, made Jack nervous. It was stupid, because Jack was the one who had suggested sharing the bed in the first place. Hiccup had seemed shy about it, which almost made Jack take his suggestion back. But here they were. Still, that wasn't the only reason Jack was unable to relax right now. It had been almost a month since he became visible again, and though people touching him still sometimes surprised him, a few weeks couldn't erase 300 years that easily after all, he'd grown relatively used to it. This shouldn't be any different, because like he'd said to Hiccup earlier, he did sometimes share his bed with Jamie. Just like this. Well, almost like this. Jack always held Jamie whenever Jamie needed that extra comfort. Jack was used to care for him, but I guess he wasn't used to being cared for by someone else. He had been cared for by North and Bunny when he was sick, but that was North and Bunny, and neither of them had offered to do something like this. Jack probably would have frozen them both if they tried. He wanted to shake his head to rid himself of that image, but he didn't dare move a muscle. He forced his breathing to even out, like he was asleep. Hiccup's heart was still beating fast, but not as fast as before. Minutes went by, and gradually the beat became slow and steady, and Hiccup's breathing became soft and almost soundless. Jack opened his eyes. It didn't do much, The room was almost pitch black. He'd never be able to use that phrase the same way again, would he? Aside from a few moonbeams shining through the entry, all Jack could see was the faint picture of Hiccup's Adam's apple. Close. Too close. Which was Jack's own fault. He'd scooted closer. Why had he done that? He'd been cold. No, that wasn't that. Alright, he had been cold, even if he liked to deny it, but if he was to be completely honest with himself, that wasn't the only reason. Hiccup had put his arm around Jack. It had surprised him, both because he didn't expect such a gesture from Hiccup, and because of his usual amazement over the fact that Hiccup wasn't passing through him. In the midst of his dark thoughts, that gesture had stopped his mind from spiraling. It made it seem a little less like the world was ending around him, and suddenly he understood a lot better why Jamie sometimes asked if he could sleep beside Jack. It didn't solve any problems, but it still relieved the pain a little bit, to just be close to another person. In all his 300 years at Jack Frost, Jack had never truly come to terms with the fact that he was invisible. He was always lonely, always looking for answers, because he was too afraid to wonder if he would be a ghost forever. All that time, he thought he knew exactly what the thing he yearned for felt like. Even if he didn't remember anything from his past life, or didn't just forget the feeling of hugging someone. So why did this feel so different? And what did it feel like exactly? First off, it wasn't cold anymore. The blanket was as warm as it looked, and Hiccup radiated heat as well. It was different with Jamie, because Jamie was so small. No, Jack was the smaller one, and he felt almost too warm. There was the faint sensation of Hiccup's breath against Jack's hair. It was barely there, but Jack noticed it anyway, like his senses were sharpened. Since he couldn't see very well in the dark, he had to rely on his other senses, which was why he was keenly aware of the weight of Hiccup's arm around him, his heartbeat, and Jack guessed he'd never really had the occasion to notice before, but Hiccup had a distinct smell too. Right now he smelled like leather and faintly like fish. Jack didn't doubt he also smelled like fish, thanks to their dinner. As well as a smell that reminded Jack of the forge. And he smelled like dragons. Maybe even toothless in particular, but Jack couldn't be sure. He just knew that dragons had a distinct smell, different from any other animal he'd ever encountered. Hiccup twitched slightly in his sleep, his breathing catching for a moment. Jack wondered if he was dreaming, and if so, what he was dreaming about. Hopefully something good. He was afraid to move, but his curiosity got the best of him. As carefully as he could, he tilted his head back, just enough to see Hiccup's face. Again, it was hard to see much, but the dim moonlight was just enough. Hiccup's head rested on his left arm, squishing his cheek. His freckles and moles were hard to see in the dark, but Jack knew they were there. The scar on his chin, too. Hiccup's brows were furrowed, even in sleep, and they seemed bushier up close. His lips were parted slightly, yet he only breathed through his nose. Jack hadn't given him much thought before, but Hiccup's nose was really round, a little on the bigger side. Jack wondered if that was something Hiccup was self-conscious about. He shouldn't be. It was a good nose. Hiccup's brows furrowed again, and Jack remembered that if Hiccup woke up right now, Jack would be 100% visible, and staring at people was generally frowned upon. Visibility did have its downsides. Carefully, he lowered his head again, back to the way he'd been lying before. He allowed himself to shift a little, just so he could lean his head into the crook of Hiccup's neck. It felt almost unlawful, but it was hard to think about consequences in the dead of night. The feeling was just so unfamiliar, and Jack had never prided himself on being able to resist temptations. Besides, maybe it wasn't so bad. Hiccup had put his arm around him in the first place. Jack might be an unparalleled case of touch-starved, but that didn't mean Hiccup didn't also like the intimacy. It was close. Too close, but not close enough. A good kind of too close. Unfamiliar, warm, safe. A kind of close that Jack realized he'd probably never had the chance to know. He also realized he was smiling. Despite everything, being Jackson Overland again wasn't all bad. It started to rain, and the sound finally lulled Jack to sleep. Despite how much he felt he'd calmed down thanks to Hiccup, his unconscious mind was apparently not ready to let go of that evening's reminiscing. The ice was biting cold against his bare feet. His skates lay beside him, removed in the hopes that he might be able to balance his weight. Hope thinner than the ice creating spiderwebs beneath him. There was a sort of thumping, like the air itself was pulsating, each beat bringing him closer to the end Jack already knew was coming. But he kept calm, his eyes trained on his sister with a gentle smile, like there was still a chance for him too this time. And even if it wasn't, he could still save her once again. He knew the scene. She calls his name. She's scared, but she's going to be all right. They play hopscotch, like they do every day. But something was different this time. Jack noticed even before his hand went to grab the unassuming staff waiting for him on the ice. His fingers grazed the ice, searching for something that wasn't there. He looked down. The staff was gone. He looked up again. Jamie was standing in Emily's place like he'd been there the entire time. He shared Emily's desperate look, but there was something else there too. Accusation. "You have to use your powers, Jack," he said, his voice thin and wavering. "It's gonna break if you don't freeze it." Jack felt as if he'd already fallen through the ice, cold spreading through his body, seeping into his flesh and bones like 1,000 knives. The pounding got louder. "My staff's gone," he managed to reply, but his voice was weak. "I don't have my powers. I can't freeze it, but we're gonna be fine. The ice made a rumbling sound as the spiderwebs grew. The sound was deafening. "You have to try," Jamie insisted. "We'll die, Jack." Jack shook his head. No, he stammered. He carefully stepped forward and extended his arm. "I'm not Jack Frost anymore. Just reach for my hand." Jamie, or was it Emily now, tried moving forward. The ice groaned and rumbled. It sounded more like a nightmarish monster than fractured in the ice. Emily gasped, her eyes darting between the cracks and Jack. Her hand was trembling. Just a little bit further. Their hands were almost touching. He'd switched their positions again. It wouldn't end well for him, but that was fine. He could no longer tell whether it was Jamie or Emily staring back at him, but it didn't matter. He'd saved them. He had to. But without his staff, he was too late. The ice couldn't hold their weight. The last thing he saw were those brown eyes staring at him like they still didn't understand what was happening, like Jack would still find a way to save them. The ice tremored, and the cold and dark enveloped them both. Jack opened his mouth to yell, but the water flowed into his lungs. It was too dark to see. He tried to flail blindly through the dark, but he couldn't move. The water held him in place like chains. All he could hear were those drums reverberating through his bones. And then a voice. "Jack, it's okay. It's okay. It's—" Jack gasped. His eyes shut open and he stopped struggling, coming face to face with a very distressed Hiccup. Then he realized why his dream self had been paralyzed. Hiccup was pinning him to the bed. What are you doing?" Jack demanded, snappier than he'd intended. Hiccup quickly let go, like Jack had burned him. "You were trashing around," he explained weakly, holding his hands up like he was surrendering. "I tried to wake you, but—" He was cut off when thunder boomed outside the hut. Jack jumped up into a sitting position as if to protect himself, but only succeeded in knocking his head painfully against Hiccup's. They both groaned. The thunder continued for several seconds, and Jack realized why the ice cracking in his dream had been so loud. And the thumping. He brought a hand to his chest. A shudder went through his body. Right. It was beating. It had been for a month now, and still it felt unfamiliar. At least right now, with the memory of his death clear in his mind. He looked down at the floor. His staff was where he'd left it. Then his eyes drifted over to Toothless, who was looking at him curiously. Baby Tooth sat on his head, and he chirped softly when Jack met her eyes, wondering if he was okay. Hiccup was rubbing his forehead when Jack turned back to him, but his eyes still were on Jack, looking like he wanted to ask the same question. If he looked as shaken as he felt, the concern didn't come as a surprise. Shame stirred in his chest, redirecting blood to his face. "Sorry," he said, bringing a hand up to his own forehead. "It's okay," Hiccup said. "Nightmare?" Jack nodded. He shuddered again and realized the blanket was missing. Hiccup seemed to read his expression because he reached over the edge of the bed, picking the blanket off the floor. He gave it to Jack. This time, Jack took it without complaint. "I didn't know this about myself, but I'm apparently a blanket hoarder," Hiccup said, slightly apologetic. "Guess there's always new things to learn about yourself." A quiet laugh made it out of Jack. His voice was hoarse with sleep. He didn't sound like himself. Hiccup smiled. "Sorry." It was hard to tell in the dark, but he seemed slightly embarrassed. For what, Jack wasn't sure. It wasn't Hiccup who'd been flailing around in his sleep. It's okay, Jack mumbled. He pulled the blanket tighter around himself as another shudder went through his body. At least his heart had started to calm down, but his breath was still shaky. Sorry to wake you. Thunderstorm woke me first, Hiccup said. He glanced at the entrance, which was shuddering from the force of the wind, and let out a weary sigh. Something tells me we're not going to take to the sky for a while. At least until the lightning stops. And hopefully the wind won't be as strong. Jack thought about Emily and Jamie in his dream. How they'd been interchanging seamlessly. What did that mean? Jack already had a theory, but he didn't like to think about it. It would have been unfair to both Jamie and Emily. Emily, who could never be replaced, no matter how much Jack loved Jamie. And Jamie, who was his own person, who'd done unbelievable things for Jack and the Guardians, and all the children of the world for that matter, and was so much more than just a look-alike of Jack's sister. But they really did look alike, didn't they? Like when Jack had seen Jamie in his new Berkian outfit for the first time, it felt as if he was seeing her again. But Jamie wasn't Emily, he knew that. At least, he hoped he knew that. A hand placed itself on Jack's arm. The touch was gentle, but it pulled Jack out of his thoughts. He looked up to see Hiccup's green eyes on him again. He raised his brows as if he was waiting for an answer. Jack blinked. What? I asked if you were really okay, Hiccup said. Jack had been tuning Hiccup out. Not on purpose, but he wasn't used to being held accountable for spacing out. Was just thinking about something, Jack mumbled with an apologetic smile. But yeah, I'm all right. What will you do while you wait for the storm to pass? Hiccup didn't look like he believed him, but he answered Jack's question anyway. I don't know. Probably lounge in the clubhouse or something, he said. I think it's still pretty early, if you need some more sleep. I'm good, Jack muttered. I don't mind if you do, though. Hiccup pursed his lips. Maybe, he said quietly, but he sounded distant, like his mind was elsewhere. His hands were folded, fidgeting slightly. Are you okay? Jack asked. I didn't hit you in my sleep, did I? Hiccup gave a small laugh. No, but it was a close call, he said. Then he got quiet again, his smile fading. Can I ask what you dreamed about? Jack's heart immediately sped up again. Drowning, he replied, trying to sound nonchalant. It's nothing to worry about, though. I dream about it a lot. Maybe not exactly like this dream had unfolded, but at least it wasn't a lie. Hiccup looked like there was no way he wouldn't worry about it. His concern was heartwarming, but Jack couldn't appreciate it. It only made him self-conscious. In this way, a part of him missed being invisible. At least his feelings had always been a private matter back then. He'd only just begun feeling comfortable showing vulnerability around the Guardians, but it was different opening up to someone as human as Hiccup. You act like you've never had a nightmare before, Jack said. It's not that, Hiccup said hesitantly. You talk in your sleep. It took a moment before Jack realized how that might be a problem for him. He steeled himself not to turn to Baby Tooth and kept his eyes on Hiccup. In Norse? Hiccup nodded. They looked at each other for a few seconds. Hiccup's silence was more terrifying than Jack expected it to be. He thought about the twins' theory that Jack would turn one day, whatever that meant, and how the Snow Queen was a legend that people feared, and all the superstition on Berk. Jack hadn't realized how much this scared him, but now his throat was closing up. If Hiccup found out what Jack was, or what he used to be... What did I say? He managed, trying to sound casual. Hiccup opened his mouth, then closed it again and cleared his throat. It was a little hard to make sense of, but... He looked down at the floor, at Jack's staff. You said your staff was gone, and... Jack's mouth felt dry. Something about ice? Hiccup continued, scratching his chin like he was nervous. You mentioned Jamie and then Emily. I think it was Emily, at least. He glanced uncertainly at Jack. Jack realized he was holding his breath only when he let it out in a relieved, soundless sigh. He nodded. Emily, he repeated. It felt weird saying her name to Hiccup, but a good weird. It made her seem a little closer. Makes sense. Is Emily my sister? Jack finished. Hiccup looked confused, like he didn't expect that answer. Oh, he said. Is Is she the one you talked about last night? Jack nodded. Your sister, Hiccup repeated, and his frown softened. I thought she was your girlfriend or something. Jack gave a surprised laugh. What? You thought I had a girlfriend? Hiccup sent Jack a weird look, but his lips crooked up in a smile. Well, yeah, he said, slightly sheepish again. You're he gestured vaguely. Fun guy? I'm sure you've had loads of girls fawning over you. Jack did glance at Baby Tooth this time, but she was very busy studying Tooth's scales. Contrary to her sisters, she'd been a little less open about her affections for Jack in the past months. Maybe after actually spending some time with Jack, she realized there was more to him than just his teeth. He chuckled. Maybe. But a girlfriend? Come on. Hiccup raised his brows. How is that weird? He asked. Jack was about to give him an answer, but then realized he didn't have one. Truth was, before he was Jack Frost, all his time and attention had been reserved for his family. There weren't many kids his age in the village, and he wasn't particularly close to those who were. Aside from all the little ones following him around, he hadn't really had friends, much less a girlfriend. And then he'd been Jack Frost, and, well, that was self-explanatory. Just is, was the best answer he could come up with. He sent Hiccup a lopsided smile. So, no, Emily is... He hesitated. I mean, she was my sister. Hiccup nodded, his expression gentle. I'm surprised Jamie never mentioned her, he said, and Jack almost swore, realizing his mistake too late. Thankfully, Hiccup didn't say it like he was suspicious of Jack. How old was she? If you're okay with talking about it, we don't have to. It was before Jamie was born, Jack said, trying to do the math. If this had been true, and Jamie was 11, then Jack would have been 6 when he lost his sister? This was getting way too far removed from the truth. Why didn't he think before he spoke? He cleared his throat. He never knew her. It's, complicated. Hiccup nodded again. How was she? He asked. Somehow, Hiccup accepted his half-assed explanation. Jack supposed he'd gotten used to them. Emily, she was a lot of things. Jack started slowly, looking out into the air as he wrung his mind for the memories he had reclaimed. Very energetic, positive, happy, a little reckless maybe, but I was never a good influence on that part. Hiccup hummed. Can't imagine why, he said. Jack smiled at him before returning to his thoughts. She was very curious about everything. Asked a lot of questions, which I usually try to answer, even if I didn't actually know the answer. His smile widened. And she always believed in me, even the most bizarre stories. Well, some of them took a little more convincing, but... What kind of stories? Hiccup asked. Jack shrugged. Legends, fairy tales, or just something completely out of the blue, he said. One time I told her I was friends with the wind. He frowned, looking down at his hands. Thing is, I feel like she believed me because the stories I told never really felt like stories. There was truth to them, you know? Hiccup looked doubtful. Even the being friends with the wind part? He asked. Especially that part, Jack said, amused. He smirked at Hiccup. Am I being weird again? A little, Hiccup admitted with a shrug. But that's all right. I like hearing you talk. Jack squinted at him. Hiccup's lips parted. I mean, it's interesting, he explained hastily. How your mind works, your musings and all, it's, cool. Cool? Hiccup pressed his lips together and nodded slowly, like he regretted saying anything. Cool, he confirmed anyway. Jack was probably grinning. Cool. I'll be sure to remind you of that when you start telling me to shut up, he promised. That's not going to happen, Hiccup said with a small scoff. Oh, trust me, it will, Jack said. I have your reputation to maintain. I'm a menace. Hiccup opened his mouth as if to argue, but then closed it again like he was reconsidering. All right, you are, he agreed, and Jack laughed. His green eyes twinkled with mirth. But maybe it's not such a bad thing in your case. I guess we'll just have to wait and see. Jack didn't know why those last words felt like a drum roll in the pit of his stomach. I guess we will, he agreed. Jack wasn't sure how many hours passed before the last lightning flashed and the storm settled. As Jack Frost, he'd always just known what time of day it was, so he'd sort of lost the ability to judge the time based on the position of the sun. Not that the ominous clouds allowed any sunlight to filter through. This made waiting a whole lot more difficult. Hiccup had disappeared to Astrid's hut. He wouldn't explain in detail, but he said Astrid had had an awful experience with lightning and would probably want some company. Jack wondered if it was somehow worse than being struck by lightning, which Hiccup had, and came to the conclusion that Hiccup probably needed the support just as much as Astrid did. He did seem a bit jumpy. Jack waited with the others in the clubhouse and did his best at making the waiting time bearable. Thankfully, his talent for fun was what made him Jack Frost and not the other way around. He and the others spent the time chatting and playing an improvised game consisting of punching a pine cone into the air between them, like an Iron Age version of volleyball. It was all right, but it didn't mean he wasn't bored out of his mind by the very end when Hiccup and Astrid finally came up and announced that it was time to go. And not only that, the twins were being weird. Not in a very obvious way. Two snot-out fish legs, it probably just seemed like they were as weird as they always were, but Jack swore there was something about their behavior that seemed off. Something about the way they looked at him, like they were trying to read his thoughts, or how they never came up within 2 meters of him. Maybe it was just Jack's imagination, but then again, the twins did have a theory he would suddenly turn evil or something. He got his answer as everyone got ready to take off. "So, are you afraid of thunder too, or something?" he asked them casually as they mounted Barf and Belch. "I mean, I guess you would be. Vikings are famous for that, aren't they?" He glanced at Baby Tooth, who shrugged in reply. Tough Nut's mouth became a thin line, glancing at Rough Nut for support. "You're saying we're famous in the future?" Rough Nut asked. Jack winced and shushed her. "Not so loud," he hissed, glancing nervously at Hiccup and the others. Thankfully, they weren't paying attention. "Also, you can't know that. You know you can't know that." "But you said—" "Well, I don't know. I've never read a history book," Jack said. "But, I guess I can say that people do know about you. I mean, not you specifically. Vikings. Bad reputation mostly, but very badass." Tough Nut smiled triumphantly. "Naturally. I've always known the Harry Hooligan tribe will leave its mark on history." Jack held back a wince. "You didn't answer my question." "Ruff and I aren't afraid of a little lightning," Tough Nut boasted, before his bravado faltered and he gave Jack a meaningful look. "However, considering our company, it wouldn't be far-fetched to say that this might not just be a normal thunderstorm." Jack couldn't say he was surprised. "You think I did this?" he asked flatly. The twins shrugged noncommittally. "Even if I still had my powers, how would I, a winter spirit, have the power to create thunderstorms?" He decided not to mention the moment with the pitch last Easter. It had certainly looked like lightning, but Jack didn't pretend he understood it. "What do we know?" Rough Nut asked. "Faye are famous liars." Jack closed his eyes, letting his head fall back. There was no way to win this argument. Why did he even try? His reaction got a scathing laugh out of the twins, and they took off on the dragon. "I'd say Faye is an improvement from Troll," came Hiccup, and Jack whirled around. He looked amused, so Jack guessed he'd only heard the last part of the conversation. "I thought they'd gotten past that. Did you do something to scare them?" "Not on purpose," Jack mumbled. "But whatever. They can think what they want." "All right," Hiccup said, though judging by his expression, Jack still wasn't a gifted liar. "Well, it's just the twins. Don't worry about them." He was about to say something more, but got distracted when Toothless came up and bumped into his side with an impatient burble. "Time to go?" Jack asked. "Yes," Hiccup said. He turned around and reached for something draped over Toothless's back. "Here." It was the blanket. Jack accepted, climbed onto Toothless's back behind Hiccup, and draped the blanket around himself. Baby Tooth settled in the folds of Jack's cloak. Toothless took to the air, and Jack tightened his grip around Hiccup, attempting to give him a bit of blanket as well. He could already tell this part of the trip was going to be a lot more comfortable, which was because he now had a proper seat and a warm blanket around himself, and not at all because of that other kind of warmth, the one that had filled him last night, and which now came rushing back as he allowed his head to rest against Hiccup's shoulder. The lack of sleep caught up with him about an hour into the flight, and he fell into a light slumber with his head lolling limply against Hiccup's back, probably drooling a little bit on him, but what Hiccup didn't know couldn't hurt him. It was impossible to say how long he dozed off. He He was never unconscious long enough to have a dream that made any sort of sense, but not conscious enough to keep track of whether the blanket was falling off, or more importantly, whether he himself was falling off. Hiccup awkwardly tried to shift him sometimes, bringing Jack's arms tighter around himself like a seatbelt whenever he felt him starting to doze off again. Jack woke up every time, but he always pretended he didn't. He wasn't sure why, but it was more fun that way. He didn't fully wake up until something small and biting began hitting his face. Blearily, he blinked his eyes open. Snowflakes. Jack sat up, looking at the clouds, blinking as the snowflakes fell across his face. A shiver went through his drowsy body, but he felt himself smile. It was snowing, and he was flying. If he kept his gaze upwards, he could almost imagine he was weightless again. Babytooth made a soft noise to his right, and Jack glanced down to see her smiling meaningfully at him. He laughed, reveling in the sudden sense of calm the snowfall provided. Maybe it was his imagination, but it felt like he was on the right track. He was getting closer to whatever it was he needed to get his powers back, or at least find a way home. Then his gaze fell on the twins flying into his field of vision. They were both giving him wary looks. Jack deadpanned, and the twins quickly turned their head like nothing had happened. "That's it there," Hiccup muttered, his voice so quiet barely caught it. "Isn't it?" Jack leaned over his shoulder, squinting through the snowfall. He thought he could see the outline of something on the horizon, something huge, like an iceberg in the middle of the ocean, or a mountain. He took a deep breath, waiting for something, a feeling or a sensation, a thought coming into his mind on his own, a glimmer of aura surrounding the looming island. There was nothing. For all Jack knew, it was just a normal, cold and dark place, because the sun had already set at this point, empty of any snow queens or other magical entities. A few minutes later they were scouting the island from above, trying to map it out and see if it was viable for a training drill. But it was useless. It was too dark, there was too much snow, and all Jack could see was steep, icy mountains, thick white-clad trees and frozen bodies of water. Jack didn't want to admit how cold it was, but he was thankful for the blanket, and found himself clinging for Hiccup's body heat like a koala. In the end, they landed by the base of a mountain, where they were a little bit sheltered from the wind and snow. Jack jumped off of Toothless and was pleased by the feeling of soft snow under his boots. He walked a little bit away from the others while they got ready, mapping out his surroundings. The woods spread out all around them, but he could see the ocean in the distance. Mountains loomed over them in the north, extending around the valley below them in a sort of crescent moon. "So, what's the plan?" Jack asked, walking back to the others again. "Are we going to go around the island somehow, or—" There was a moment of hesitation on Hiccup's face before resolution took its place. Well, he started. "The plan is that we split up and meet at the base of that mountain. I was thinking that frozen river over there." He pointed and Jack tried following his gaze. He could barely make out a thin, reflected line in the distance by the base of the opposing mountain. "Would be a good meeting point." "That's quite a hike," Jack commented. "Yes," Hiccup said, and didn't look too happy about it. "Luckily for you, you won't have to worry about that." It took Jack a moment before he understood the meaning of the message. He turned around. "What?" Hiccup's lips were a thin, almost nervous line. "Usually one of us stays behind to watch over the dragons," he explained, and Jack swore he sounded cautious. Still, he gave Jack no time to react. "But now that you're here, even though you're not supposed to, I was thinking you could do that job." "You thought that, did you?" Jack asked, crossing his arms. "Jack," Hiccup sighed, "it's too dangerous. I already told you. At least you have the dragons to protect you if something happens. If you huddle up to Toothless, he'll keep you from freezing to death." "But I've already made the decision." Hiccup had the grace to look a little apologetic, but it didn't do anything to stop the anger rising in Jack's chest. Hiccup gestured at a chest that had been previously tied to Toothless's back, which was now lying already half buried in the freshly fallen snow. "There's food and some extra blankets. I expect it'll take us a few hours before we reach the river, so might as well get some more sleep. We'll call for the dragons when we've arrived." Jack forced his expression into a neutral one, but he couldn't help rolling his eyes. "Fine," he managed to say without sounding sarcastic. Hiccup was just keeping him safe, and it wasn't his fault Jack had a weakness complex lately. It was supposed to be the other way around, after all, and Jack didn't like feeling helpless. "Hope you have a safe safe-ish trip then, without your dragons. Crazy Vikings. The last part came out in a gruff mumble, but Hiccup looked like he caught it anyway. He smiled. "Thanks," he said, and turned to the others. Jack let them have the briefing without really paying attention to it. It didn't take long before each dragon rider trudged into the dark forest one by one. Naturally, Hiccup stayed behind last, after bidding Astrid a safe but reasonably challenging training drill. Once she was out of earshot, Hiccup turned back to Jack. "Don't look so grumpy," he said, almost pleadingly. Weird. Jack had thought he'd been hiding his grumpiness quite expertly. "All I wanted was a little adventure," Jack said melodramatically, because the cat was out of the bag anyway. He leaned on his staff and heaved a great sigh. "What if I wait here and something happens? I mean, I know you're used to snow, but it's dark and you've never been to those islands specifically, have you?" "I'd love to have some company, but that wouldn't be very fair to the others," Hiccup said. Jack raised a brow. "It's a competition?" Hiccup's resolution faltered. Not officially," he replied. "But it doesn't matter. At least we're used to these drills, and hopefully the dragons residing here are familiar. If there are even any dragons." He looked disappointed just at the idea. Jack didn't like the sound of that. Even without dragons, there were still 1,000 other ways to reach an untimely end in the deep, cold forest. If he and Hiccup went together, he could... What? Hiccup wasn't talking nonsense. Jack was less equipped for this kind of thing, whether he liked to admit it or not. All he could do to help right now was giving cryptic advice about staying off frozen ponds. Besides, he had other things to do. Things it was better he did alone. General annoyance aside, this was one of the most convenient situations he could have ended up in. "Just don't take any unnecessary risks," Jack muttered. He didn't notice that he was walking towards Hiccup until he stopped in front of him to run a hand idly over Toothless's scales. "I'm sorry, but I don't want to hear that from you," Hiccup replied. Jack smiled, but it didn't quite quench the anxiety in his chest. He fixed Hiccup with a serious look. "Just promise to be careful," he said. "And don't try to cross the river. It's freezing here, but you never know." Hiccup's gaze seemed piercing in the dim lighting. It looked like he was searching for something in Jack's expression, but his face softened before Jack could deduce if he'd found it or not. Maybe he just imagined it. "I promise," Hiccup said. His lips quirked up in a reassuring smile, and something inside Jack's ribcage did a somersault. Then he looked at Toothless and patted his snout lovingly. "Well, better get this over with then. I'll see you in a few hours, and..." He hesitated, glancing at Jack. "I'll make this up for you later, all right?" Oh, Jack definitely didn't deserve that. He was the one who snuck on the strip in the first place. Hiccup held his gaze for a few seconds longer, like he wanted to say something more, but then he just gave a faint chuckle and turned around. "See you," he said, before heading into the dark of the forest. "See you," Jack echoed quietly, continuing to brush over Toothless's scales to distract himself from the urge to run after him. Those kids were crazy. His hair would turn gray from stress if they kept doing stuff like this, while Jack couldn't protect them. At least he assumed he was stressed, because his heart was doing some ridiculous Dance Dance Revolution performance right now. "Dance Dance Revolution," he muttered, earning a curious chirp from Baby Tooth. "Amazing what people get for Christmas these days. Or, well, in the future, I guess." "I hope whoever received it didn't mind a present lightly used by a winter spirit." Baby Tooth looked like a question mark, and Jack decided to stop talking about Dance Dance Revolution. Instead, he let his hand fall from Toothless and down to his side. He looked around himself once again. He should give it at least an hour or two before he went to look for the Snow Queen. He didn't want to accidentally bump into one of the others. Hopefully she was real, and hopefully he'd find her and get her help, and then return here before the drill was over. Hiccup and the others wouldn't even know that he'd gone. "Do you feel anything?" he asked Baby Tooth. Baby Tooth closed her eyes, and aside from her wings, stood completely still in the air for a few seconds. Then she shrugged helplessly. Jack sighed. "No, me neither," he muttered. The dragons had all settled down, apparently used to being left alone. Well, almost alone. Jack was happy that they'd accepted him, but it also made it harder knowing that he'd have to defy Hiccup's orders. Toothless had curled into what looked like a scaly donut, and Jack eyed the little space in the middle, just big enough for him to curl up in. It was probably warm there. It really was freezing. He hoped the others would be okay. Baby Tooth gave a sudden squeak, and Jack realized a second later it had been his niece. He smiled apologetically, out of habit, even though the cold wasn't his fault this time. He held out his hands, and Baby Tooth settled in them, letting Jack cradle her to his chest. "At least I can keep you warm now," he mumbled as he walked up to Toothless. He sent the dragon a light smile. "Mind if I join you?" He didn't know how Toothless understood, but he did. He shifted one of his wings as Jack settled down beside him, then draped it over him, a lot like Jack had just wrapped his hands around Baby Tooth. Jack had never felt more like a Matryoshka doll. He pulled out an extra blanket from the basket Hiccup had given him and leaned against Toothless's ribcage. A satchel hanging from the saddle dug into Jack's chest, so he moved Baby Tooth to his neck and removed the satchel, cradling it in his lap instead. It was almost warm like this. Toothless's skin was coarse and hard, but the slow breathing and the comfort of having a dragon wrapped around himself was enough to make Jack's eyelid feel heavy again. He yawned. "Wake me up in a couple of hours, all right?" he mumbled to Baby Tooth. "Might as well catch some Z's before we find the Snow Queen. Don't want to make a bad impression, right?" Baby Tooth tweeted, but Jack was already too out of it to understand her. When Jack woke, he wasn't cold. He wasn't warm either, and, to his surprise, he wasn't lying curled up on the ground. With a jolt, he realized he was standing upright. He felt his breath leave him. Immediately, he decided he had to be dreaming. But nothing about this felt like a dream. The sound of faint activity through wooden walls and the howling wind outside was as clear as a bell. The smell of firewood, cinnamon, and baked goods was just as Jack remembered it. Everything around himself was solid and real, but it just couldn't be. It had to be a dream. There was no other way he could be back in North's workshop. The more he listened, the more he could hear the muffled sounds of the rest of the workshop outside. The ringing of bells, yetis yelling, indistinct music, and the clatter of 1,000 toys being made. North's personal study looked exactly the same at first glance, but Jack could feel his heart sinking the more he looked. The room had always been cluttered, but now things, objects, toys, tools, were scattered on the floor. Most of the candles were unlit, no classical music played, and on the table the ice castle stood, completely untouched since the last time Jack had seen it. Behind the desk, leaning his head in his palm, sat North. He looked nothing like himself, almost as bad as he had at Pitch's peak of power last Easter. Old and tired and grey, his brows furrowed in a way that suggested he had a bad headache, his eyes looking puffy, suggesting... Jack swallowed and took a step forward. He realized he wasn't holding his staff, but pushed that thought to the back of his head for the time being. "North?" he tried, his voice weak. North stirred, but didn't open his eyes. Instead, he ran a hand over his face, muttering something in Russian. "North!" Jack repeated. North jumped to his feet in alarm, his eyes flashing wildly. Then they settled on Jack, and his face went slack. "Jack?" he whispered. Jack was a bit stunned himself, to say the least. "What?" he started, but didn't get any further before North almost stumbled towards him. Jack expected a bone-crushing hug, but was instead met by the chilling and familiar feeling of being passed through. They both staggered back. Jack looked down at his hands, his breath catching in his throat. No, this wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. "Jack," North said, making Jack's eyes snap up to him again. He was holding up his hands like he was trying to calm down a cornered animal. He's okay. Calm down." "Easy for you to say." Jack wanted to spit, but he couldn't find his voice. Instead, he held North's gaze, and North held his. North could see him. At least he could see him. What's going on?" Jack managed after about a minute of heavy breathing. "I should ask you that," North said, and to Jack's horror, his voice quavered. His hands hovered in the air like he wanted to reach out. Jack's chest constricted painfully. "Jack, we thought... Where are you? What happened?" Is this real?" Jack asked weakly. "Yes, it is real," North said, happiness lighting up his face for a moment, but it faded all too quickly. He struggled with his words for a moment before sinking to his knees to get on Jack's eye level. "You and Jamie, you disappeared, and now you, Jack, His eyes flickered upwards for a moment. "You are human." Jack glanced up as well, spotting the brown locks of his bangs. He let out a shaky breath and nodded. "I don't know why," he muttered. "The time fragment sent us back in time. What happened to it? Is everyone okay?" North's brow furrowed deeply, but he nodded. Jack wanted him to elaborate, but he seemed more focused on Jack's well-being to think about the others. "But how are you here?" he muttered. Then his eyes widened in horror. "You are not... are you?" "No," Jack hissed. "No, I'm alive. I lost my powers. And I don't know how I'm here. I don't know why you passed through me, either." He frowned, looked around himself again, and recalled what North had started to say earlier. "North, how long have we been gone?" "1 month," North said. "You, Jamie, and Baby Tooth." "They're okay," Jack said, managing to smile even as his chest felt like it was being filled with cold water. They'd been gone from the future for as long as they'd been in the past. We landed on some place called Berk. Have you heard of it?" "Berk?" "It's, in the Viking era? Don't suppose you were alive yet then, were you?" North's eyebrows went up to his hairline. "That is impossible," he muttered, scratching his chin. Jack couldn't let him get lost in thought just yet. His heart was still threatening to break his ribs. "I don't know what to do." He hadn't meant for his voice to come out so small and desperate. He hadn't meant for those words to come out at all. He just needed North to listen to him. And North's eyes went back to Jack's, his expression tightening into a horrible mix of sympathy and sadness, like he'd already given up. Jack knew he hadn't. He was Santa Claus. Of course he'd never give up. But his paranoia was threatening to convince him they were beyond saving. I've been trying to regain my powers, but I think the time fragment took them from me when we were tossed through it," he continued, trying to make his voice stop quivering. "But nothing works. I tried flying, but... North..." His face suddenly broke into a slightly hysteric smile. "There are dragons there. How are there dragons there?" North stared at him for a few seconds before suddenly getting to his feet. "Come on," he said. "We need to call the others." He stepped carefully around Jack as to not pass through him and headed to the door. Jack followed. The workshop looked exactly like it should. There was no trace at all of the attack, even if it had apparently only been a month since then. Either the Yetis were extremely efficient workers, which they were, to be fair, or there had been magic involved in rebuilding. The vast room buzzed with activity as always. Jack was glad. Even if something horrible had happened, the Guardians couldn't just stop doing their jobs. It had been the same when Sandy had disappeared last Easter. It was tough, but they had no choice but to pick themselves up again. Still, North's office was a different story. Jack couldn't quite bring the sight of it out of his mind. The idea that his disappearance could affect someone like North in such a way. Jack had never felt like he was taking up this much space. The feeling was so unfamiliar, he didn't know what to do with it. So he filed it away, hopefully never to be felt again. "What happened after we disappeared?" Jack asked. "The time fragment, it didn't follow us, did it?" he asked. North's face was grim. "Sandy knows most about it," he said. "He managed to trap it before it could wreak any more havoc, but it is only a matter of time before it breaks out again. Without crystal, it cannot be held down forever." "The crystal," Jack murmured, running a hand through his hair. "But the crystal broke. It exploded when I touched it. Isn't there some way to find another crystal, or make a new one, or something? Maybe shards of it are still in the cave?" "No, we checked," North said as they walked up to the globe. He put his hand on the lever that would alert the Guardians, but hesitated. The look he sent Jack was so wrenched and worried, he almost looked like a different person. Jack hated it. It wasn't right. "All that is left is one single shard. Everything else disappeared without a trace, and making a new one is too dangerous. That kind of power is too much, even for us. It would kill us." Jack felt nauseated. "Then what do we do?" he asked. North turned the lever, and the globe lit up with an array of colors, the northern lights, and expelled them across the world. Jack forgot about his worries for one blissful moment, his eyes going wide at the sight. He'd never seen this in person before. Then North turned back to him and leaned heavily on the control table. "Time fragment," he started. "Or time creature itself. It is a living proof of the horrible things that will happen if you try to meddle with time. That kind of power is not for people like us, or people at all, but Of course, people are still people. They never stop until it is too late. Long time ago, there was a brotherhood of warlocks. They wanted to achieve power to bend time to their will, as many before them, and many after. It should have been impossible, but somehow they found a way. Or so they thought. There was a theatrical pause. Even in the grimmest of times, North still had an affinity for the dramatics. Then he took a weary breath. Inner circle of the Brotherhood met their untimely end the very moment they thought they had achieved their goal. They tried making Spirit of Time take residence in the body of one of the warlocks and to trap it in there. But that kind of power is too much. It broke out of the body, but not before adopting a piece of the warlock's humanity. His thirst for power. The result was almost catastrophic beyond repair. Sandy remembered the old text about it, but the story is older than even him. Complete disaster was scarcely avoided, but many lives were lost. Warlocks, spirits, innocent humans. The Brotherhood realized their own foolishness and decided in last moments that they had to face the consequences of what they had created. But how could they destroy something so unspeakably powerful? Jack thought about the time fragment. How he hadn't been able to understand what he saw when he looked at it. How small he felt in the face of its glowing eyes. It was alive, but it was far beyond anything they understood, and the only chance in the face of its power was to run away. Or at least attempt to. And that was just a fragment of its complete form. The Brotherhood had attempted to control time, but had instead created a monster. The offspring of immense power and humankind's hunger for it. They didn't destroy it, Jack said hollowly. They trapped it. North nodded. The creation of crystals was devastating, he said. One person was not enough. Whole Brotherhood and many more paid the price of creating something strong enough to hold time itself. Countless lives were lost, but in the end they managed to cut monster into pieces. Each crystal was hidden away in place people would never find them. Jack began leaning on the control table as well, but ended up just sinking to his knees instead. It's my fault, he murmured. I didn't think I just wanted to remember. Jack, North said gently, getting down on his knees as well. He reached out as if to take Jack's hand, but stopped himself. You could not have known. You cannot blame yourself. But Jamie is there with me, Jack snapped, looking up into North's agonizingly exhausted eyes. Jack had done that to him. Jack had done this to everyone. And Baby Tooth. And I don't have my powers. We've been there for a month already, and I'm no closer to figuring out what to do. I have to get him home, North. Jamie... He stopped himself when a chilling realization hit him. His family, Sophie and Joyce, He trailed off when North averted his eyes. As far as they know, Jamie disappeared in woods while playing with his friends, he said. They are still searching for him, but it was the last straw. Jack's eyes stung. But you have to tell them, he said, his voice just an unsteady whisper. That he's alive. In another time, but still I'll get him home. I will get him home. They have to know. He did even sound convincing to himself. You know we cannot do that, Jack, North said gently. Then what can I do? Jack asked. I don't have my powers, but there has to be something. We are trying to figure it out, North said, his eyes drifting over to the fireplace on the other end of the room. A golden chest was placed on the shelf. Sandy managed to trap the time fragment for the time being, but we do not have long until it breaks free. Our only clue is the shard we found in the cave. The golden chest glinted in the light of the globe. He frowned. Shakily, he got to his feet and walked across the room. North looked puzzled, but followed him. When Jack reached for the box, his hand passed through it. He felt a stab of anger. Not just people this time, huh? He mumbled. He looked at North. Open it for me? North did, and put the chest down on the salon table. Inside the chest, placed gingerly on a red pillow, was the shard. Jack's stomach twisted. He'd like to say the shard looked completely ordinary, but that would have been a lie. Even such a small piece radiated power, like traces of the time fragment still lingered inside it. Or maybe what Jack was feeling was the traces of the lives that were lost in order to create the crystal. All that sacrifice, only for Jack to let his curiosity get the best of him and shatter it. With this crystal and his memory box last Easter, Jack was starting to see a pattern. He stared at the crystal as he tried getting his next words out. Maybe Maybe I can recreate it, he said. A new crystal. I was the one who created this mess to begin with, so... Out of the question, North interrupted. Jack, it would kill you. Jack looked up at him. If it gets Jamie home, I don't care, he said. It was a lie. He didn't want to die. But if it meant Jamie would be safe and happy, he couldn't care. North's eyes flashed with something that looked almost like anger. No, he said. We will find another way. What way? Jack yelled. I don't have my powers, and I don't even know why. I'm trying to find the Snow Queen, but I don't even know if she's real and if she's... The Snow Queen? Jack's growing anger subsided just a little. Yeah, he said. Some children were talking about her. They think she's a fairy tale, but... Have you heard of her? Not in a long time, North said. And only in stories. But maybe he was interrupted by a broken gasp. Jack! Jack's heart leapt into his throat at the sight of Tooth, but he still quickly backed away when she tried to hug him. Don't, he said. He felt a stab of guilt at her hurt expression. Jack tried for a smile, then carefully reached for her hand, only to let it pass through. That's not very pleasant, he murmured. Jack, Tooth said, her eyes shimmering with tears. Oh, I thought I'd never... Jack didn't really want to hear what she thought, because he was afraid she was still partially right. But thankfully, she was in turn interrupted by a shrill series of tweeting, and Baby Tooth suddenly flew into Jack's face. And she didn't pass through him. Baby Tooth? He yelped. Baby Tooth chirped incessantly at him, and Jack tried his best to follow. Something about appearing here by herself and heading straight to the Tooth Palace. Of course she had. She'd explained everything to Tooth already, which was probably why she wasn't surprised to see Jack the way he was right now. But how are we both here? Jack said, throwing a glance at North and Tooth. I was partially convinced this was just a dream. It is not a dream, Jack, North said. I do not know how, but somehow you are here. Both of you are. Jack's eyes gravitated towards the crystal without even thinking about it. Somehow, he knew it had something to do with that. But why? Why was he here? Was the time fragment trying to show him something? Not likely. Maybe it was taunting him. If it had been anything more than a chaotic force of power, that might have been it. But that didn't make any sense either. Still, this vision, or whatever it was, had made a few things a little clearer. You said we've been gone for about a month, Jack said, looking up at North. And we've been on Berk for just as long. How? I mean, we did travel back in time, didn't we? Wouldn't it make more sense if we arrived back here just in the next second after we disappeared? Unless... He got a dreadful feeling. Unless we didn't travel back in time. How else can you explain the dragons? Maybe we traveled to a whole other dimension? The time fragment doesn't have the power to do that. Jack almost jumped at the sound of Bunny's voice. He turned around just in time to see the floor close up behind him, leaving no trace of a rabbit hole. His face was grim, but his eyes widened when he saw Jack. Bunny, Jack said, hating how his voice wavered. He shifted awkwardly, gesturing with his arms. Yeah, human again. I can't explain it either. Bunny's mouth opened and closed a couple of times before he slowly walked closer. I've heard about dragons roaming this world before, he said, and though his voice sounded steady enough, he was looking at Jack like he was convinced it was just a figment of his imagination. I thought it was just a legend, but if what you say is true, then it is true. Tooth nodded. Baby Tooth said the same thing, and not only that, they've tamed them, she said. Right, Jack? Jack managed to smile and nodded. Yes, they've befriended them, but it wasn't always like that, he said. Hiccup told me... He stopped himself, realizing this wasn't the time to talk about Hiccup or dragons. Then Sandy appeared, floating down from the window in the ceiling. His face lit up, and Dream Sand flashed excitedly over his head. Despite everything, Jack instantly felt calmer. He let out an amused breath. Hello, Sandy, he said. They were all there. Jack didn't know how he felt about seeing them if he couldn't even touch them. It was like he was there, but not really. A feeling he knew all too well. At least he had Baby Tooth, who had settled on his shoulder, probably just as relieved to find someone who didn't pass through her as he was. He recounted to them what he'd already told North. On more than one occasion, his voice quavered, and he had to stop. Crying in front of the Guardians, or crying in front of anyone, was out of the question. He'd already shed a few tears in front of North, and that was more than enough. It's like when I couldn't use my tunnels while the time fragment was here, Bunny said. Like it sucked out that power once it saw it, somehow.
Maybe perceived it as a taunt, Tooth pondered. Using the tunnels instead of traveling like the rest of us. It's kind of like cheating time, isn't it?
Jack frowned.
Cheating time?
He repeated before running a hand over his face. Cheating time? You don't think... I mean, we're immortal. If there's anyone cheating time, it's us. Is that why I'm... But my powers came back, Bunny interrupted before Jack could spiral into panic again. After Sandy managed to subdue the fragment, the ability came back. It took a little while, but then again, I wasn't swallowed whole by it like you were.
You think my powers will come back?
Jack asked. The feeling of hope was almost painful. He didn't want to be disappointed again. But he supposed if anyone would be able to give him hope, it was Bunny. Bunny's brows were furrowed as he gazed at Jack. Maybe, he said. Just don't think that all is lost yet. We still have a chance. Sand flashed over Sandy's head, and Jack swallowed thickly. Sandy is right, North said. Whatever we have to do it quickly. Time is running out, or time is breaking out. You know what I mean. Bunny nodded. If you think you know a way to get back, you have to do it quickly too, Jack, he said. You haven't been thrown into another dimension, but it can't be a coincidence that the time passed here in the present is the same as in the past. Maybe you're still connected here, to your present. Whatever the reason, we have less than a year, and that's a generous estimation. We have to hurry.
Bunny,
Tooth started, throwing nervous glances at Jack. Jack could only guess his panic was beginning to show on his face. The Snow Queen, North said, making Jack look up at him again. He looked stern, and Jack knew he was thinking about Jack's proposal earlier, about creating a new crystal. You're on the right track by looking for her. Maybe she can help. Sandy frowned. The sand over his head formed the figure of a woman in a huge dress and a crown, holding a scepter with a snowflake on top. And then the image disappeared, replaced by a question mark.
She's real?
Jack asked.
You've heard of her?
A ticking clock appeared in the sand, followed by an X and another question mark. Jack frowned.
She disappeared?
He asked. Sandy nodded, his expression grim. Jack looked down at his hands. A spirit disappearing wasn't anything new. If not only the believers, but also the spirit's story faded into obscurity, as would the spirit. It made another possibility slither uninvited into Jack's mind. The reason for why he'd never heard of Berk, or the barbaric archipelago, or why dragons were no more than a legend. A spirit would fade for good if there were no more people to remember its story. And the archipelago is a dangerous place, Hiccup had told him. Jack swallowed down the lump in his throat. He looked at the shard in the chest. He didn't know why he thought he could pick it up when everything else passed through him, but somehow he knew he could. Jack, Bunny said warily as Jack approached it, but Jack ignored him. The crystal couldn't hurt him any more than it already had. He picked it up, and the Guardian's eyes widened. Jack looked down at it, and he felt a sudden tug in his gut. His hands, they were fading. He looked up.
I'll find her,
he said hastily, knowing what was about to happen. He closed his fist around the stone.
And I'll find a way. I'll get Jamie home and...
He didn't get any further. The world blurred and went dark.